Research misconduct. This is a source, the Swedish Research Council, good research practice. So you can download this from the internet. So research misconduct is bad because it undermines the confidence in published articles. It also erodes the trust between researchers, funders, and research participants and the entire community, I would say. So choice of treatment methods, construction methods, bridges, aircraft, safety conditions, education policies, all are based on research findings. So if the research is flawed, then all these policies would also be problematic and they will cost society dearly. So it's based on a misconduct. The research results end up in harming society in general. So it also negatively affects the academic merit system. If you work super hard and someone is really doing misconduct and publishing, more than you and promoting fast, that would be very hurtful. You see, a researcher who cheated might surpass other colleagues. So what would be the effect if we don't do anything about that? You know the tragedy of the commons, right? We'll destroy the common good, which is our knowledge base. And others will start doing that, so that everybody at the end of the day will end up in cheating. So then we'll have a low-level publication. I mean, there are some institutions that experience that. So misconduct, if it is regular and tolerated, it undermines the trust in the merit system. Others might be tempted to engage as well. So how common is misconduct? There's no, because it's like corruption, right? So it's very difficult to, unless you really, meticulously follow it up on and find some exclusive information, it's very hard to know. But the figure that I'm going to give you is really very low. You can see during 1994 and 2006, it's a bit outdated information, there were 3,571 reports for the US Office of Research Integrity. Misconduct was found in 165 of this. That's about 5%. All right, so they reviewed only this. But remember, these are government institutions. They don't have the resources to meticulously look at every case. So that's why researchers say that this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can simply go back and look at your departments as well, and then see the profiles of people and how people do research. That will give you some sense. Pryor and co-authors in 2007 document that 18% those participated in project leaders stated that they had a direct experience of misconduct in the last year. So you can see that depending on who you ask, the figure can be high. Another paper, which you can find in that Swedish Research Council document, is Diverison et al. 20% of researchers consciously changed the design, the method, the results of a project when pressed to do so by their funders. So this is purely research misconduct. What people might say, they will give you reasons, I didn't have any option, otherwise they were going to take away the funding. But is that really a good justification? I doubt it. There's a so widespread perception in the research community that others are acting dishonestly or bending the rules. It's human nature. It's very difficult to completely avoid it. I have to be honest with you. Because where there is corruption and nepotism, there's also corruption, nepotism, and misconduct in the research community as well. Our objective is to minimize it, to reduce it to the minimum possible. So what is misconduct in a narrow sense and also in a broader sense? I have two definitions for you. First one, the obvious violation involving the theft of other people's ideas and data, manipulation or falsification of data, and plagiarism of other people's texts. This is the narrow definition. But at large sense, it also encompasses other forms of reprehensible behavior, such as dishonesty towards funding bodies, exaggeration of one's qualification in applications, publication of the same study in multiple contexts, sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is also a felony as well, by the way. Defamation of colleagues, sabotaging a colleague's work, and so on. These are all research misconduct. So the broader definition is the one. The narrow versus broader definitions, which definition do you agree with? If you agree with the narrow definition, which means that some behaviors will be unpunished. So usually it is recommended that to have a comprehensive definition. I think over-exaggerating your qualification for funding bodies by itself is also a misconduct. Nowadays, it has improved substantially into including how you comment on conferences. You are participating in a conference, so you might say something offensive for others when you're, giving your comments. I mean, there's a freedom of expression is one thing, but, expressing offensive or comments and things are also another thing. So many institutional, conference organizers are coming up with ethical code of conduct. It's a very recent thing in the past 3-4 years. That's what I see. I mean, those guidelines for research, yes, but for conference participation, there are also misconducts. You have to follow those guidelines. It's also important to distinguish between intentional fraudulent behavior from carelessness, rushed work, and incompetence. You see, these are all unethical parts, but is it intentional fraudulent behavior or carelessness? Or is it rushed work and incompetence or lack of capacity? But it doesn't mean that it's an excuse. But you have to differentiate. So a more formal definition that is kind of widely used in this research council. So the Swedish Research Council is comparable to the South African National Science Foundation. Research misconduct entails actions or omissions in research which consciously or through carelessness lead to falsified or manipulated results or give misleading information about someone's contribution to the research. So it falls pretty much in the narrow definition. So to avoid subjectivity, a parallel disjunctive definitions are made. So parallel definitions, 2 questions need to be answered. So before you define. One is, has the author diverged from good research practice in their work? Has the author intended to deceive or mislead his or her readers? So these are the 2 things that you need to consider. Whether they deviated from good research practice and whether they did it intentionally or not. And then that will determine. So one may exist without the other, and the answer may range from yes, no to not obvious or unclear. So a more informative judgment can be made when the answers are combined. But I will show you now. This is like a general introductory remark, but what are the misconducts, the specific misconduct types that are common? The first one, and the most notable one, is fabrication and falsification. You fabricate the data out of thin air, or falsify it as well. You twitch some of the data, you just change it so that you get some significant results that kind of give you the hypothesis that you were hoping on. It means making up the data and results and presenting them as genuine. Sometimes adding the asterisks, you remember? We're always conscious about that asterisk, like statistical significance. Is it significance at 1%, 5%, 10%? So if it's not significant, you add 3 stars. What the hell? Let's add 3 stars and then publish the paper. That's what we want, but that's a very dangerous strategy. The most obvious misconduct, fabrication, is a multifaceted phenomenon. So manipulating the research process, equipment, material, data that makes the research project is not represented in a trustworthy way. Leaving out certain data and experiments from the report. Right? Some part of the data is excluded so that you still, again, want to get the result that you're looking for. Manipulating the report itself, example, altering diagrams and pictures so that they give misleading figures or misleading message. How about outliers in data? What do you do with them? Well, should they be excluded? Or they should be declared and a clear argument should be offered if they're excluded. You dropped the outlier data, but you have to specify, state to the editor, or you trim them and you just replace them by the average value because you thought that they were really genuine errors, and then you did check other variables so you can get hint of what kind of household or what kind of firm it would be. So you changed it, but you need to explain it clearly, argue. So manipulation of research can be an intentional consequence of carelessness or lack of knowledge, but still, it will be a misconduct of a different degree, right? Both are misconducts, but probably the sanctions might also be a little bit different. Whether you did it on purpose to deceive people versus lack of awareness or rushed work. It's still unethical practice. So fabrication and falsification. The second common misconduct is plagiarism. It refers to misleading information about someone's contribution to the research. The most common research misconduct, according to the Swedish Research Council experts. These days, the most common problem, yeah. So it's more than falsification and fabrication. By the way, before we move on to plagiarism, falsification and fabrication these days, if you use World Bank data, then you are required to submit your codes when you submit in journal, in good journals, at decent journals, not the predatory journals. They will publish whatever crap you send in. But the good ones, top field, like 2 levels, 3 levels, top field, the reputable journals, when you submit your paper, you're also required to submit all the codes and the data so that others can replicate all the data. If you collected experimental data, you conducted the experiment, like I told you the other time, like the day before yesterday, you have to register it first so that the whole world knows what you are doing and also the hypothesis. So how are you going to analyze the data? What are your hypotheses? Then when you collect the data, you write your report and everything, and the paper is about to be published, you'll also be required to submit the data together. This is a recent phenomenon, like 5 years ago or 4 years ago. All journals started doing that. That's mainly because of falsification and fabrication. Even in big journals, people falsified and fabricated. Added, statistical significances. But now you can't do that, because if you do that, and then the data is available there, someone will immediately check. And then your paper will be retracted. So let's be very careful. And this is typical behavior of present biased behavior that we discussed yesterday. That means your really immediate gratification is, let me defend this PhD, I don't care what happens, but you will lose all your reputation and everything you worked hard for if you make that mistake. So plagiarism implies presenting others. A scholar text excerpts ideas, data, results as own. It can be considered as lying and stealing. A formal definition of plagiarism is, it entails the researcher using material, text, ideas, hypothesis. Check all these, text, ideas, hypothesis, designs, methods, data, results, or conclusions. So don't panic, because sometimes it's methods and is a bit tricky, right? If you, for example, RCT, nobody owns the method of RCT. You can still use an RCT. I think they included it in some specific contexts. I think there's some natural science disciplines or medical science disciplines. I think there might be some methods of your own that you created somehow. I think they probably want to refer to that. But in economics, methods are not a big issue. This panel data econometrics is a standard method that can be used by everyone, so no problem with that. Consciously or through carelessness, in such a way that it presents a misleading picture of the researcher's contribution to the project at hand. So it simply is giving credit to the author who is writing the paper, but that work is someone else's. That's what is called plagiarism. So you see, there was this cartoon at some point in one of the journals. So plagiarism is basically stealing someone's knowledge, you see. Plagiarism also includes using your own material in misleading ways. Assume a researcher stole the data and published a paper out of it. Okay? What makes it plagiarism is not the theft of the data, rather claiming that data as your own data. That's what makes it plagiarism. You obviously work on other people's work. When you build on other people's work, results, and data. But it's very important that you clearly and honestly show how you build on this. This is something that we see very often. Sometimes people are just cutting and pasting paragraphs. I told you about the former German defense minister when he defended his PhD. There's a couple of paragraphs I think he copied from someone else. A couple of paragraphs. Because of that, those couple of paragraphs, the guy lost his job. He was fired immediately, and his reputation was ruined. And that happened after 10 years he defended his PhD. So when you especially go high up, the target on your back also gets bigger. I heard that expression. So all contributions of other work by other scientific communities should be acknowledged. Publications should also not be delayed, and other materials or text should be made clearer. It's simple to avoid plagiarism. How do you avoid it? When using other people's data, methods, ideas, or formulation, state the author and the source. That's very simple. Building on others' work. When using other authors' text, paraphrase, summarize or reference quotation, name the author, refer to the original text. There's a saying actually, use quotation marks and indentations clearly to indicate the source. If you're using exactly what the person said, you put them in quotation marks and then indicate the source. But if you are paraphrasing what they're saying, it's only enough to cite the paper itself. These are two things that you should remember. Actually, some places the rule is very tough. If you're using like more than 3 words consecutively from the source, it should be quoted instead of paraphrasing. You see? So that's strict, but it's very important to at least differentiate these two. Put in quotation marks and put the source, or paraphrase it. Change the way it is said. Use alternative words pretty much without altering the message, and then use the source. Sometimes using others' important ideas, hypotheses, distinction, concepts that state the source as well. This can apply to conversations, presentation, articles, and books. By the way, you can also plagiarize ideas. If I told you that I'm going to run an experiment in a couple of weeks, I have this idea, and then you go and tell your friends and you run the experiment, that's plagiarism.
But you can't, there's no evidence to back it.
There will be, exactly. That's a great point, and that's what this is what we call congruence. We're coming towards that. So you will have to have evidence, but I can cite all the rest of the class participants as evidence. That's it.
Well, isn't it for intellectual property? Doesn't have to be in material form. Like, it can't just be an idea. It has to be written down.
No, it can also be idea, unfortunately. Yes, ideas. That's exactly the new part of it that you will know when you take this course. Probably you know the basics, like written text, published text. Even if it's unpublished and it's an idea, you have to acknowledge that source. You have to write in a footnote that this idea was obtained from this person in this kind of conversation. Okay? And even lecture notes as well can be plagiarized as well. If you change your name and use this lecture, I can claim that you're plagiarizing my materials. This is my intellectual property right. How about theories, methods, concepts that are widely known? Well, it's important to take caution, but they're not considered as the author's own work. The theory of demand is not owned by anyone, right? So you don't need to cite any source for it. But if it's a new theory or the new empirical strategy that we haven't heard before, you need to mention. There are common practices with a number of subject areas, so it's important to make sure that no one draws benefit from it and no one is misled. So you're not misleading your readers when it comes to the knowledge that you are reflecting there. How unpublished material. Publication. The text is available to the general public for legitimate use. So you publish the paper, so it's available, so you cite that published paper version. But materials can also be used before publication. Example, lecture notes, presentations, seminars, etc. So you should be cautious while using these sources. For example, some might be preliminary work by PhD students. Have you seen these papers at some point? They said not for quotation, or don't cite without contacting the author, because people are avoiding the responsibility because the results are very preliminary. So when you do additional estimation techniques, data analysis, and robustness checks, the results might change. So you should be very careful with that. The PhD student should be consulted before citation. Consent must be obtained. This is to protect the PhD student from harm, their reputation. In some cases, the student may want to wait until the work is published or a defense has been conducted as well. But maybe not necessarily in economics, but in some other disciplines, you don't want the paper to be cited and things like that before they defend their thesis. Even someone has access to the material for a review or examination, such material should be handled with confidentiality. We do evaluate theses for different universities. When we receive the thesis, we should be very careful not to share it with anyone. It's confidential, and even the instruction always tells you that this is confidential. You cannot share it. If you share it, you're violating that confidentiality principle, and you might end up harming someone. Using parts or ideas from it or publishing it without providing the source is not only plagiarism but also theft as well. So such an act puts the entire evaluation system at a risk of collapse. So you cannot steal ideas from the manuscript or the PhD student's thesis, because the PhD student is going to take them time to publish their paper. So you're an experienced researcher, so you can write the paper in a week time and publish. But that would harm your PhD student, so you abused your position of trust. Self-plagiarism. This is also another slippery slope that a lot of people misunderstand. It's common to refer own work, previous results, research problems, etc. You confirm or repeat previous results, a clear account of earlier work should be done. So if you are exactly, this is similar to what you've done, for some reasons you decided to continue. In some cases, for example, I saw that it was a cross-sectional data, but new panel data comes. That will improve the estimation strategy substantially. So it might be considered as a new contribution, but you have to remember to cite your previous paper. If you don't cite, you're on purpose omitting it so that people would think that this is very original. That's clear ethical violation. Complete sections of a text chapter is also possible, but should be clearly stated that the text appeared in earlier text. Neglecting this would be self-plagiarism. You can copy the data, one paragraph, two paragraphs from your previous paper. That's plagiarism. You can't copy. Otherwise, you can see that here is the description of the data that appears in this publication. So you are referring to the previous publication. This is another area where people get a problem. Is it really plagiarism or double publication? I think there's a debate about it, but it's somehow it is clear. If it is exactly like publishing a paper which pretty much resembles the previous one, that's not plagiarism. That's more of double publication or paper cloning. But if it is like a part of a paragraph, like a couple of paragraphs we copied, that is self-plagiarism. So both are not acceptable practices. Plagiarism of a text, it calls for a clear congruence between the work in question and the suspected source. Using the internet, databases created for this purpose can be used. There are some, now before ChatGPT and other things, now there was a couple of other plagiarism detecting softwares. So you can ask actually two sources to see if there are, or put in a paper and see if there is any text that exists that looks like this text. It's even much easier now actually to do that. So ideas, sometimes, by the way, this is what we call be aware of false congruence. There are many ways of expressing something. Actually, this is something that is clearly put in this. Maybe it's coming in the next section. But what happens is, especially in some discoveries like medicine, science, and etc., two groups in different parts of the world were working on a similar research idea. And then they came up with a publication pretty much at the same time. Is that plagiarism? You have to verify, because for plagiarism, I will show you how do you establish plagiarism. There's congruence, false congruence. That means this is just pure coincidence. Did one steal from the other? Probably not. These people never met, these co-authors. There was no way that one would have known about the other, because sometimes these research are also secret, right? Because you cannot make them public because of intellectual property right reasons. So in that case, it's impossible for one group to steal the idea from the other. Many discoveries in science were made by different researchers at the same time without any plagiarism. So when you establish plagiarism, you should be careful. Then how do you establish plagiarism? And then how do we evaluate the likelihood of suspected sources indeed the source? So it could be that the idea have been available to all accused researcher. See? Someone is accused of plagiarism. You ask the first question, is there any chance that this idea was available to this person? The answer is yes or no. And then the second is, if so, how likely could this or she have known about it? So any evidence suggesting that the researcher might have owned, read, or spoken of the suspected source, what was the source published in a journal that those in the research field usually read. Okay? If there a great deal of congruence, and if the answer to all of the above is yes, plagiarism can be established. You see, this is how you establish whether someone plagiarized or not. Okay? People will come with complaints, so the first thing that you will ask is what? How likely that the person might have known about that work or read it? And how was the source published? Was it published in a journal that we are supposed to read, economists? Sometimes it's possible that the paper was exactly similar, but it was published in, a forestry journal, that is, or a natural science journal that we don't read. In that case, you might be able to defend that I've never known about this research. There is also a great deal of congruence, and if the answer to above is all yes, and plagiarism can be established. But remember, the accused person also has a right, so their voice should also be incorporated. It's important to hear the perspective of the accused. How do you explain these similarities? What is your relationship to the expected source? So you have to ask the accused person as well. That's when you establish plagiarism. So one thing that contributed to plagiarism is the publish or perish academic environment. It forces people to focus on quantity rather than quality. So you want to use shortcuts. So one of the areas where we need intervention is how the research environment is shaped up in the university. These co-authors, DeVeris and co-authors, in 2006 study, they showed that 4 out of 5, this is like 80% of researchers, felt that their most successful colleagues work the system to achieve their status. What do you mean by work the system?
They are connected. Not connected to be automated.
Yes, work the system means that they use some sort of their connections and things and networks and a bit of nepotism. That's what it implies. The most successful colleagues, they feel that the most successful colleagues do that. So adding research it requires a long-term prospect, improving the research environment. Most urgently, research misconduct should be addressed in the merit system. You have to create a good environment, and you should have a zero tolerance for misconduct and nurtured good practice. So you have to have a zero tolerance. So who is responsible for plagiarism? So the university vice chancellor, or we call it president in some places. I think in the former Anglophone countries it is vice chancellor. Some other places it's president. In the US, the university is highest administrator is a president of the university, and his deputies, research heads and things are also vice president. But some places vice chancellor, pro vice chancellor, etc. But the vice chancellor, like the main person responsible for the entire university, has a responsibility for ensuring high standards followed and ethics is formulated in the university. So the VC is ultimately responsible for activities in the higher institution, in your university. You have to have a clear responsibility to investigate misconduct if it is raised. The same is true for the head of the research institutions. So you're not working in university, but it's ERSA. If it is ERSA, the head of ERSA has a responsibility to investigate these. Cases of misconduct should be discussed and lessons should be learned. And supervisors have a responsibility to educate their students and be good role models. This rests, a big responsibility on supervisors. One other thing is, of course, continuous discussion in a course on research ethics is important. When I was a PhD student, I didn't take a course like this. I finished it in 2011. That was a long time ago. But after that, we've changed it. Since 2016, in the PhD program, you're required to take a course on research ethics. Of course, not only academic writing, but also the ethics part. One way is to combine them as one big PhD course. So it's common for students to commit plagiarism at the level in essay writing, for example. Lab report example that I gave you is common. So both education and the risk of detection deter unethical practice. You have to educate people, and then, of course, you have to sanction people. Exchanging ideas and interacting openly, example, seminars reduces the likelihood of misconduct. You have to bring in these discussions in staff meetings and PhD student meetings if there are plagiarism cases. So that will deter others, actually. There's always... The human mind responds to two things. One is threat. The other is reward. So both threat and reward here. Here, so you have to have a detection mechanism and also a clear sanction for people. A great deal of the cheating is revealed by chance sometimes. It is always good to have a critical eyes. For example, you have been asked to examine any thesis. Anyone who was given the responsibility to examine someone's thesis, like undergrad or masters, you did. Did you check if they plagiarized or not? Sometimes, exactly. You see, so you find it by sometimes. What? It feels like this paragraph is familiar, right? That's why we say that most of these cases are exposed by chance. So it means that the problem is really deep rooted. And like I said, when you grow up and become a big person, people will start digging these kinds of things. So it's very important to be aware of it. So some ethics principles and research. So let's talk about the sanctions and then move on to how you do, high quality research or high integrity and avoid misconduct. So research misconduct is a serious act, so it leads to serious consequences to the researcher. So if it happens, it's made that it's public. This is a very important requirement. If you find someone, like you are the head of a department, and you find one colleague actually conducting a research misconduct, you cannot hide it. You have to make it public. What's the purpose? Why do you need to make it public? Exactly, to give signal to others that we can't tolerate these kinds of behavior. Departments, it's very important to do so to deter others. Departments in research environments must not want to be associated with such cases. So you have to basically issue a statement, especially if it is a public, like a published source and was cited, for example, in a newspaper in the country. And then now it was found out that was plagiarized or some unethical issues involved, the university should issue a statement saying that this kind of misconduct doesn't represent our hardworking colleagues. You have a responsibility to do that. Employers can address clearly established misconduct consistently with labor laws as well. Labor laws will not protect you from misconduct. If you committed misconduct and fired from the department, the labor laws are not going to protect you. The Swedish Research Council, I'm sure the South African National Science Foundation, for example, will respond to plagiarism. If you're found plagiarism, even in other project, we have been funding you, we can immediately discontinue the funding. And in some cases, we might even ask you to return the funding, even if you didn't cheat in that specific project. It was another project, but it's still, you will be sanctioned. Yes?
So one of the, it's a double-edged sword, but in South Africa, most of the universities are public institutions.
Yes.
And if you work for any public institution, to fire someone is incredibly difficult. And even if someone has been found guilty of plagiarism or academic
misconduct,
that does not guarantee that they would be fired. So yes, your reputation will be ruined, but you can still earn a salary from a university.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a bit strange.
Yes.
Yeah, because the courts cannot. So if you go to court, I mean, that person, what they would do is they probably would go to the court if you fire them, right? So with the labor union. So the labor union is very unlikely to endorse them, right? So, but of course, I mean, we know people have been accused of serious corruption and things, and they were able to get away. But in principle, that's not how it should be. This is just more of the standard. I mean, in the West, there's no way. You'll be fired immediately, and no labor union will represent. And if you go to the court, you will waste your money. I think the best way would be to quiet down and disappear in the sunset so that nobody knows about it. And then after a few years, things will kind of, and then if you really regret it and you want to resume your life, that's the best way to do it. And if you fight back, everybody will know more about it. Yeah. A broader perspective, so misconduct. So the classic definition of misconduct, it's negligence. Okay. I think we're coming to a winding kind of paragraph. So misconduct is deliberate fraud, fabrication, data, plagiarism, negligence, broadens this definition. We talked about it. There's another document that I recommend, the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity of all European academics, ALLEA. It endorses a broader view on misconduct. So the code was revised in 2017, and it was issued as the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, revised edition. I strongly recommend that you go through it. And if your department doesn't have these kinds of well-advanced documents, you can learn from this document. It's a very comprehensive document. So it urges that in addition to avoiding falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, researchers should comply to the following good ethics principles. So we talked about now more of the misconduct, right? So your work you should always be honest. Your method should be reliable. You have to use standard. You have to be objective. Even if you don't like the outcome very well, the outcome of the research, you should communicate it as it is. You should not include your own opinion. Should be impartial and independent. Should not be pressurized by anyone to reveal the outcomes of that research. You have to have open communication. That means it's very good to communicate your research. That has so much advantage for you as well, in terms of citation, in terms of improving your reputation. An obligation to safeguard the interest of research subjects. This goes without saying. Confidentiality, anonymity, and all these issues. And fairness, an obligation to nurture the next generation of researchers. So we all have these responsibilities as researchers. Should remember them very well. And research ethics courses, highly recommended to give such a course already in the graduate education before embarking on research. You have to go to your departments now and recommend to your head of department to have a course like this, at least a seminar. A 2-hour seminar to start with will be very important on unethical issues. Graduate students, including undergrads. If we comply, a large share of these misconduct can be avoided, but the few pathological cases cannot be avoided by these conducts. So by training people, you can reduce the problem, but there might be 2 or 3% that are pathological cases. For this, what would be the solution? Sanction. You will have to sanction these people. You have to remove them from the academic environment.